think it is.
How are we doing? Can you hear me? Is everyone else's mic working?
Hello.
Fiona?
Hello. Yes.
Rosanna? We're good? All right. Here we go. So guys, I don't know if you know this. This is the first time people are seeing this. So a huge round of applause to Muhammad Ali and to Fiona here for an exceptional film. Again, The Accused, Damned, or Devoted.
I do want to say one thing. Our editor, Safi, is also here, and
Hey.
he
Yeah.
was very much part of getting the story together.
A round of
So
applause
thank
for
you,
Safi. Beautiful job. We're going to have a Q&A for the next 40, 45 minutes or so. We are going to have a few questions between us, and then we're going to throw it to you guys. So if you have anything you want to ask, we can go to that. But first, I want to start with you, Muhammad Ali. You say that this was the, quote, most dangerous film you've ever made. What do you mean by that?
I think not just me, anyone or any documentary filmmaker or any writer or journalist who approaches the topic of blasphemy, and that too in Pakistan, you're really putting your life in danger because especially how it's a very, very sensitive issue and how you want to handle that. There's a myriad of reactions, and I mean, you can even see just from what just a few of the cases that I show in this movie. It is something that can follow you even just beyond Pakistan. So, for example, Asia Bibi, who is currently in hiding and is in Canada in asylum, but she's in hiding. And the reason she's in hiding is because as soon as she landed in Canada, even over there, she got death threats from a specific group that was affiliated to TLP, supporters of Rizvi, that said that we would kill her.
You've never shied away from controversial issues. Was this a difficult decision to make when you were approached by Fiona and the BBC to make this film? Did any part of you think, I don't know if I want to do this?
I didn't want to do this. In fact, the first time I was approached, because the danger issue was certainly there, and I wasn't sure how I could tell this story without putting me or my subjects or my crew in danger. And I already had experiences of pushback and vitriolic pushback with some of my previous films, like Among the Believers, in which I followed the Khatib of the Red Mosque, or even to a certain extent my previous film, Inshallah Democracy, which was a political satire in which I kind of went after the military in Pakistan. So there was always a pushback. With this, I would be the most intense. And I was like, do I really want to do that? And I needed a narrative way to tell this story that would ultimately at least try to have an editorial that's safe for everyone involved. And ultimately, once I found out about Rizvi and we started following him, that was kind of what attracted me to the story, because he is fun. He's a star. Rizvi's a fun.
He has a great turban, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he's like a Bond villain. You know, he's in a wheelchair. He's swearing and he doesn't even know what he's talking about half the time. Really, just a cat is missing, and I immediately knew this guy's out of control, and I really have to follow him. In fact, we had just met at IFA in Amsterdam.
You and Fiona.
Yes, this was in 2017, and I was heading back to Pakistan, but I was flying into Islamabad. And when I flew into Islamabad, I had still not fully gone into following Rizvi, if you remember, or we weren't really making that story.
We're doing God's Prosecutor to start with, weren't we?
Yes,
Yeah.
but when I was in Islamabad, it was the fall of 2017, and a shutdown happened, which is what you see in the film, when right after the parliament was trying to pass the language in the electoral bill, and the pushback that happened with TLP. So I actually found myself in Islamabad in the middle of all of that. And eventually what happened was the government kind of cowed down to TLP, and they even gave them reparations and said sorry. And that really pissed me off, because I'm like, here we are again. My country is coming down to a despot. And here he is trying to represent my faith for all of us. So I had to say fuck you to that. And so that was eventually what, excuse my language, Frontline, that I had to kind of go embark on.
I think an important point to point out here, though, is Mo lives in Pakistan. He was born in Canada, but when he was 4 years old, you moved back to Pakistan, lives in Karachi. This is a very real and present threat, a real present danger. I mean, when we consider all the vignettes that we saw throughout this film, is that if you start speaking about this issue, which obviously is an issue, your life is at risk.
Yes.
And did any part of you or anybody in your social circle or even your family say, maybe this isn't the one that you should be working on?
Yes, all the time. I get that quite a bit. And I always promise that I'm not going to get into making a film like this. But ultimately, and it's not unique to just me, I think with any filmmaker, once you're really in that story, you really want to, and if it's a great story, you really want to follow it to its conclusion. And so I always felt compelled to do it, you know?
But also, I think, so just to interrupt, but it was something that was ever present in all our minds, how to make something that was safe for Mo and the team and those who agreed to have their names put on the end of it. And interestingly, I think, well, we've talked about this, that actually were it to be shown to Rizvi, he'd think it was fine. Because he says these things which, you know, most of us think are just shocking and abhorrent and terrible, but he will own those words completely, and I think genuinely would feel that the film, there's an impartiality to the film. We don't comment on what he does, there's no narration, it's just presented as it is. So by the end of it, I don't know, but I do feel that it's as safe as it can be, because it is literally just presenting different opinions on this particular issue. The danger, of course, is even saying the word blasphemy and having any criticism about it is dangerous. That's the thing. We're worried more about the publicity of it than the actual film.
There you go. So Fiona is the executive producer of this film. It's going to be broadcast on your TV, so set your watches on BBC4 on March the 2nd, so you can watch it again. Fiona, when this film was in the very early stages, help us a little bit about where the idea or where the sort of conviction, for lack of a better word, came from to make a film about blasphemy, which, as you know, in Pakistan is something that can be quite dangerous and very taboo. Yeah.
Well, my involvement, I made some film called Murder in Purdah in Pakistan about 15 years ago, which I think was the first film about honour killings that was ever made, and that was particularly sensitive. And blasphemy even then was an issue that was, you know, obviously present and ever-present danger. And when Mo was prepared to do something on this subject, I couldn't quite believe it, because it is such a difficult thing to do. And this is the first time, as far as I know, that anyone has ever made a film about what's going on with the blasphemy law in Pakistan. And I don't know, I think there was something, when Mo went and then sent those pictures of that lockdown, I couldn't quite believe it, because I wasn't seeing it on any news channel. I mean, I'm afraid we were all obsessed with Brexit in this country. And that was all that was happening. There was nothing coming from overseas at all. And you thought, oh my goodness, this is one of the most important stories in the world in terms of people worry about ISIS and Syria. You know, Pakistan is a nuclear power. I mean, we're talking about, we had Al-Qaeda came from just across the border, Northern Territories, all of that. People forget about 9/11. They forget where it all came from. It's that part of the world. And it just struck me that it was something that was being completely and utterly ignored. No one was talking about it. And it was extraordinary to see a government held hostage in that way. And it wasn't, I mean, you might have found it in the foreign pages of the FT or the Guardian, a tiny thing like this, but it was not featuring, and I didn't see how that could possibly be. So it just became a sort of, this has got to be made, if it can be made. Anyway, I don't know, but hopefully people will pay attention, because Pakistan is hugely strategically important, and we are not paying attention to what's going on there.
Massively so. Pakistan, a country which I happen to come from, although I grew up in Canada, my family is originally from Pakistan. It's also a country that I've reported on extensively. My former producer, Saira Jaffer, is sitting in the audience when I was working with Al Jazeera English. And my former colleague, Imran Khan, who's also reported extensively on Pakistan, is here as well. We've talked a lot about what you just mentioned, Fiona, which is the fact that Pakistan in some ways has fallen off of the radar when it comes to the news cycle. When you consider 2011 with bin Laden, when you consider all of the sort of extreme events that were going on in Pakistan when Pervez Musharraf took the country into the so-called war on terror, Pakistan was a fixture on TV screens, but has largely fallen off of it for a number of reasons, some of which are harder to explain than others. I do want to bring in Farzana, who's here with us. Farzana, our very extra special guest, again, an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program with Chatham House at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. I want to talk to you specifically about blasphemy in Pakistan, and more importantly, blasphemy laws. And to get a bit of background here, and I'm just going to bore you guys with a bit of history here. Blasphemy laws on the subcontinent were first sort of codified, if you will, in the 1860s under British colonial rule. These were laws that were expanded in 1927, and in 1947, with the creation of Pakistan, they became part of Pakistani law. But it really wasn't until the 1980s, between 1980 and 1986, under the rule of General Zia-ul-Haq, who was, of course, a dictator in Pakistan, did these laws really become Islamicized, for lack of a better word. They were really sort of expanded. And that's the point where I want to turn to you, Farzana. Explain to us the sort of genesis of where General Zia was coming from when he expanded these laws, and perhaps take us to the point where this law was not only on the books, but also could result in the death penalty.
Well, you're absolutely right. The blasphemy laws are based on laws that were introduced by the British when they ruled over India, the 1860 laws that you've just been talking about. And these were subsequently incorporated into what is known as the Pakistan Penal Code. The laws of blasphemy introduced by the British were intended, and I think the film does mention this, if I recall, were intended really to protect all religions against offense, as it were. But what has happened in Pakistan is that these laws have now been manipulated, well, they were manipulated in the 1980s to particularly protect Islam, so that Muslims and their faith became, as it were, the privileged religious faith and religious community in Pakistan. So there is a big difference between the 1860 laws and what we have in Pakistan today.
There's another dimension to this, and this takes us back to the 70s. And I promise you this isn't going to be a history lesson, but I think it really helps us figure out where this is rooted in. In the early 1970s, under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the Amedy sect, which is a minority religious sect which calls itself an offshoot of Islam, was essentially described or codified within law as infidel. Is that fair to say?
Well, as non-Muslims within...
Non-Muslim.
Yeah.
And this law is widely seen as trying to codify that, trying to ensure that this sect of Islam, or they call themselves a sect of Islam, would essentially forever and ever be pushed to the margins of society, and there's a law there to ensure that happens. But help me understand, Farzana, how did this grow into what we're seeing now, where we're seeing Christians being targeted? But I think it's also important to mention that the vast majority of people who are targeted with blasphemy laws are Muslims.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the Amedis because, in fact, the phenomenon that we witness of a modern state, namely Pakistan, enthralled to medieval laws of blasphemy, actually predates the 1970s. Of course, that was a crucial turning point. In 1953, a few years after the creation of the state in 1947, Pakistan experienced its first major anti-Amedy riots. The aim at the time was on the part of religious parties, pro-Islamic parties, to have the Amedy minority declared non-Muslims. And that was, of course, I would imagine, the first attempt by Islamic parties who shared many of the features with the TLP today to try and unconstitutionally unseat a government. It failed, but of course in 1974 we had Zade Bhutto, who at the time was prime minister, and enjoyed a majority, get approval for a constitutional amendment which actually designated Ahmadis, who regard themselves as Muslims, declared non-Muslims, stripping them at a stroke of their rights as citizens, because of course, as most of you will know, being a Muslim in Pakistan gives you special rights.
And I think it's important to point out that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was the leader of the PPP, the Pakistani People's Party, was not a religious party. It wasn't sort of seen as a religious extremist party. In fact, if anything, some could argue it was a relatively socialist party. It was roti, kapra, or makan. You know, it was like food, clothing, housing. That's really what they pushed on. Where did the Amedy question become a thing for somebody who was essentially saying, hey, I want to give people food, clothing, and housing. I'm here for the people?
Well, you're absolutely right. This was a party that, by all accounts at the time was seen very much as, a party that promoted a socialist agenda, but also, more disturbingly for Pakistan, was seen to be promoting a secular agenda. And this came in the wake of this immense political trauma in Pakistan in 1971, when Pakistan lost its eastern wing, which was then East Pakistan, today Bangladesh. And there were many inside Pakistan who believed that East Pakistan was lost because Pakistan was not Islamic enough, that it had somehow reneged on its Islamic commitments. And so someone like Zade Bhutto felt that pressure. And in fact, this concession, this constitutional amendment that he got passed, this concession to the Islamic right, he thought would actually help appease opposition to his government. But it did exactly the opposite, much as, of course, we saw in 2017 with the resignation of the law minister at the time.
I'm glad you bring up the issue of secularism. I'm going to sort of outline a bit of my own ignorance about the country that I'm ostensibly from. I was reporting on Pakistan's first ever democratic transition of power, which ultimately saw Nawaz Sharif become prime minister for the third time, but it was a democratic transition of power. And I remember being at Punjab University, again with my colleague Sarah Jaffer, talking to young university-age students about what they hoped for this government, what they hoped for the future of their country, what they hoped for this really sort of significant moment where we were really seeing one democratically elected government holding a full 5-year term, handing over to another. And again, in my ignorance, and again, as somebody who maybe grew up in Canada but comes from a Pakistani family, I asked the question about secularism, which is, presumably you young liberal arts students believe in secularism and want to see a secular Pakistan. That was not what they wanted. That is not what they saw. And this leads me back to you, Mo. when it comes to the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, I think it's pretty safe to say the majority of Pakistanis support them.
Yes.
Why? I mean, when we consider, all the vignettes that we saw in this film, whether it's Salman Taseer, whether it's, Shabazz Bhatti, whether it is, Asya Bibi, when we consider the fact that these stories have become not only stories within Pakistan, but around the world, why do you think within Pakistan there is such a conviction that these laws need to remain enshrined in law there?
Well, I'm sure Farzana can speak much more because obviously,
But as somebody
But I
who
can-
grew up in
what I
Pakistan,
can tell you, just from specifically just following this specific story and through that specific lens, is that, and this happens a lot, it's not just once or twice, but Rizvi kind of appeared from nowhere in this current election cycle. And he kind of became this pretty driving entity. I'm not saying that he was going to certainly, we didn't think he's going to win the election or anything like that, but for a brand new party, just getting the amount of support and wave that he did was pretty amazing. And in the short time that he did. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One reason, of course, that many people argue is that the establishment itself creates these kinds of, the military establishment in Pakistan finds specific puppet politicians like Rizvi or whatever, or they kind of create an environment where these kinds of figures rise to the top really, really quickly to kind of implement or control their own political policies. But aside from that, I think Rizvi was espousing an Islamist socialist agenda. And that appeals a lot to the vast majority of Pakistan that is very much underclass and poor, and that is very disaffected and ignored largely by the huge political elite. And so when a character like Rizvi comes along, they're like, and you can even see it when we were seeing some of the electioneering and campaigning, that these politicians have done nothing for us, but Deen is going to do something for us. So religion is going to do something for us, and that's why, these types of characters kind of.
do you make that connection then when you consider Pakistan's current Prime Minister, Imran Khan, former cricketer, has vowed to defend blasphemy laws and has been very clear in his defense of these laws. Do you think that's born out of that? Well, the PPP,
Absolutely,
we
absolutely.
had Sherry Rahman
He's-
table a
he's-
bill saying that
Well,
she
he wants to win. If he doesn't, yeah, it's political suicide.
Can I
If
just
you
step
say-
in for a minute and say that, in fact, one of the things that I appreciated in the film, but that perhaps came out in altogether too nuanced a form, but I think still needs restating, is the extent to which the whole issue of blasphemy is tied to profound uncertainty over Pakistan's Islamic identity. Pakistan's identity is deeply contested, and this ties back to your question about secularism. And there is this question remains unresolved to this day, and that question is Pakistan as a modern Muslim state to take its place amongst the global community of nations and take the responsibilities as a member of the global community of nations, or does it in fact represent a state that aspires to act as some sort of guarantor for Islam? And I think this question, with some sort of divine purpose, this question has never really been addressed or
from
resolved.
1947, or can you pinpoint a date where suddenly this question about what this country...
The creation of Pakistan, it's I would say its formative weakness lies precisely in the ambiguities of the state. The whole question of what kind of state Pakistan was meant to be was never really resolved. And of course, what politicians and the military and sections of the establishment have continued to do pretty much consistently since 1947 is to invest heavily in the stock, I would call it the stock, of the political language of Islam, because it always pays. It always pays.
Fiona, I often get asked a lot, Pakistan, what's going on? And the answer I always have is complicated. Fiona, as a filmmaker, as the executive producer of this film, how did you approach this, given the complexities, given the layers, given the controversy, given the potential of it becoming something that could harm the people that you've spoken to in your film? How did you approach the making of this film alongside Mo?
Golly, in a way, I think the easiest way to answer that is to talk about how I managed to raise money to make the film.
Sure.
Because it was actually having to convince other people that it was worth having the film in their countries to broadcast. And we did get co-producers from France, Germany, the Danish, Scandinavian countries. Interestingly, we haven't quite got America yet, have we? Which is interesting. But
Inshallah.
Inshallah Nation, is that what it is?
But I think it was primarily, we were lucky in that the moment when I was going to Amsterdam to try and get co-production for it, Asia Bibi had come back onto the agenda. And cynically, a Christian woman on death row is quite an easy sell to an international community. Which is profoundly depressing because actually, as Mo says, this is an internal crisis within Pakistan anyway, and that should be what people care about. But you have to find a key in for the rest of the world, and that was a way in. So we introduced more of Asia Bibi than we thought we ever were going to. We were trying to do just a distinctive story within Pakistan to talk about it is a nuclear power, it's hugely important. Why has everyone forgotten it? We have such short-term memories. I remember even the Gulf Wars. Do you remember? You say the Gulf War, and people go, Gulf War? You say, well, there was one before the recent one. We are very bad at history. In this country, we are very bad at history anyway. So then it was, okay, well, let's try and tell the story, but let's try and tell it in a way that's safe. And we did start with the idea of doing, following a prosecutor, a blasphemy prosecutor, just to try and get inside the head of why somebody thinks it's so important and to follow the trajectory of their case. That we thought would help Mo and then we were going to go through a system of making sure they were comfortable with the film and the rest of the world would still be amazed at what they were saying, rather like Rizvi, but they would be safe because they had kind of said, yes, this is okay. But then we had all this layering of it actually being used in the political arena, being used to garner votes, and we were sort of lucky that it was happening during the election time, which I'm afraid made for a longer film than most people would make, because 59 minutes is easier to take. But then when you got into the election and then you saw Imran Khan is using Islam as well, it suddenly did become multi-layered in a very different way, didn't it, Mo?
Yes, and I mean, one of the reasons I was a little hesitant about making a film on the blasphemy laws in Pakistan wasn't just obviously just a safety concern and trying to find an editorial in. I also am very cognizant of the fact that I am Pakistani, but I operate and the films that I make are very much for a global and Western audience.
Sure.
And I think as any writer, journalist, or even filmmaker will tell you, is that you can pitch a story and what will sell and what's not going to sell.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is one of the things that I've experienced, my colleagues have experienced, which is when you report on Pakistan, is oftentimes within Pakistan and without Pakistan, we're talking about the diaspora community, they will often say to you, why don't you say anything good about Pakistan?
We did.
I was there.
We did for CBS. We did. We did the most positive story on Pakistan that anyone's done in the American network.
I would challenge that. I did something better. But the point is that Pakistanis, I think, have a very justified grievance with how the world depicts them, which is through a relatively narrow lens of intolerance, extremism, bigotry, hatred, and as a brown seething mass. I don't think this film does that. I think this film actually shows Pakistan in a very nuanced way. But I want to take this back to you, Mo. Of course, this is something that you are sensitive to as somebody who lives in Pakistan, who lives in Karachi, and no doubt goes home and, sits around and your khala says to you, beta, why are you saying this? Why are you making films like this? How do you approach these stories knowing that there's going to be a very large segment of society, including within your own family and friend structure, who are going to say, I think you're being really unfair to us?
So I think the nature of documentary making itself, especially feature documentaries, this is outside of just current affairs, the documentaries that I kind of specialize in, observational. A lot of it can be exploitational. A lot of it can be poverty porn.
Yeah.
It can be, especially because you're making it for victim stories for a Western Orientalist gaze.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do that, and one of the reasons I was pretty adamant about including stories outside of just Asia Bibi. I'm not at all, poo-pooing Asia Bibi's story. Her story is hugely important, and are minorities persecuted against in Pakistan? Of course they are. That's what I try to show. But to not mention how Muslims are also victims of this, that is not your complete picture. And that is actually then falling into that Western gaze. And so that was important for me editorially to fight back against that. And what I'm in a privileged position to do, what I can do is that, at least with my generation of filmmakers and even younger than me, is that now many of us are indigenously from Pakistan telling our own stories. And so we can still, so you're from Pakistan, great, tell us stories about terrorism or honor killings or asset throwings, fine. But do it
truthfully
and organically. And I think that's something we can fight against.
I do want to open this up to questions, but very quickly, I do want to say, those of you who haven't been following Mr. Rizvi's case very closely, a few days ago, a Pakistani court sentenced 86 members of his far-right religious party to 55-year prison terms each for taking part in violent protests against the acquittal of Asia Bibi. Rizvi himself is currently out on medical bail as he faces charges of inciting hatred and violence at the rallies, which I think in a way underscores the complexity of characters like Rizvi and how they fit within Pakistani society, and lend to what Mo was saying, which is there's very likely some elements within the Pakistani state which supports and allows for groups like this or people like Rizvi, and I could give you examples of other people who may have risen to prominence with that support. One of the challenges of reporting on Pakistan is oftentimes you fall into what people would like to call conspiracy theories. And from my own experience, living in Pakistan, working in Pakistan, trying to understand Pakistan and the opaque nature of how the Pakistani government function, how the Pakistani military government, or the Pakistani military functions, is this is a country where people aren't really told the truth often. They don't really know what happens to their leaders when they're assassinated, or why they were assassinated, or why certain decisions were made. And that really creates this culture of confusion, and I think it's something, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here when I say that when it comes to the establishment, whether it's the military or the government, that they exploit that to their own means. But I'm not going to monologue here. I do want to open this up to questions. We do have a microphone around here. Let's go to the back with Imran Khan. You have a question. Can you stand up? Show us your nice scar. Imran Khan, not that one. Yeah.
Thank God for Pakistani nepotism. I get the first question. Thank you, Mr. A question firstly. This isn't a new thing. We've seen this before. We've seen this at the very beginning of Pakistan, where Muhammad Ali Jinnah used the Kashmiri Afghans to go into Kashmir under a religious. We've seen it with Sami al-Haq and General Pervez Musharraf. We've seen this happen. My question's about social media and the amplification of it. The most interesting thing, and congratulations on a brilliant film, by the way, but the most interesting thing is this amplification by social media. How did that impact your filmmaking? Because it's something that we have to deal with every day. Every day I open up my Facebook, my Twitter, I see hate. And this is now something that we have to deal with. But as a filmmaker, but more importantly than that, as a, Pakistani, how do you combat that hate?
So let's see what happens with the eventual release of this film and how that plays out. But I can walk you through an example on my previous film. Among the Believers was a film which I made on the aftermath of the Red Mosque, if you guys are familiar with the siege of the Red Mosque in Lal Masjid, in which I was following a militant cleric for several years, and his attempt to basically fight with the state. Once the film came out, and I think we were pretty objective to Maulana Abdulaziz, who was the cleric of the Red Mosque, there was a lot of coverage that we got in Western press saying that this is a very scary film. It shows this sociopathic imam and his attempt to kind of try to take over the country, whatever. Anyway, we suddenly started getting a lot of death threats, and by we I mean myself and a lot of my crew members directly on social media, and it got so bad that we kind of had to deactivate our profiles. We also had to stop going from film festival to film festival. And a lot of it had to do with the Red Mosque's own heavy social media presence. So there was a lot of knee-jerk reaction. And this is all new territory. It's like, how do you deal with this? So what we decided internally was that we were going to go back to Pakistan, to Islamabad, and meet with Maulana Abdulaziz, and show him the film. And that's what we did. We went back, we showed him the film, I recorded him seeing the film, and then once that was done, I had him issue a statement. And he said, this film is totally fine, you guys have shown my point of view fairly and objectively. You've also shown the other side, which is fine, but I don't have a problem with this. And then we took that, and we uploaded it right away onto YouTube, and then we tagged all like these different big Lal Masjid accounts, and the threats dissipated. So it was kind of like our own little ad hoc way of managing the threats that we were getting. And what's important to notice here is that it's not that these threats were coming directly from the Lal Masjid themselves. It was all these followers that were kind of making our lives miserable. And
Just very quickly, before you get to the next one. So the second part of that question was, which I think you misunderstood, Rizana, like this idea of social media amplifying this hatred within Pakistan itself. Mobile phone, one of the first countries to have mobile phones, cheap internet, relatively. How does Pakistan combat that? That's the second part of the question I was asking.
Very difficult, and I think the point that needs to be underscored here is that there's no doubt that there has been an escalation in what I would call, cases of righteous anger, of religious outrage, both domestically, but also globally. I mean, globally, I would argue there is what I would describe as a global economy of outrage. And Pakistan very much sees itself as part of that vanguard leading the crusade against what some people describe as Islamophobia. But there's no question that social media has enabled cases of blasphemy. I mean, I think we saw even in the film this young guy, whose picture of this dome. The rate at which these messages which cause outrage can now pass from one to another has caused an escalation, which perhaps may not have transpired in quite this way without the help of social media. So there's no doubt that social media has been absolutely crucial, at least to my mind, in generating and escalating what I would call these feelings of outrage.
Razana, thank you. We have another question from the audience here.
Hi, fantastic, brilliant film. My name's Sabra Amedy. I'm one of Britain's youngest imams, and I'm from the Ahmadi Muslim community, the community which you talked about, and the law which was passed in '74, Ordinance XX. What I wanted to say was a question, and also my comment first is, as a Muslim, I'm disgusted by Rizvi saying that blasphemy has anything to do with Islam. I don't know what Sharia law he talks about. The only Sharia law that exists is the Holy Quran itself. My question to you is, what do you see the future of Pakistan looking like? And what do you think, who runs Pakistan, the government or these extremists? And if so, why is that?
Yeah.
ISI?
Yeah.
ISI.
Can we start with you, Mo?
Yeah.
So yeah, the establishment runs Pakistan. The military, I mean, they have for a very long time. I think they don't have to do military coups anymore. So that's an improvement. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
They have power without responsibility,
Yeah.
which is the best deal of all.
It is a good deal. Anyway, so what I will say, and this actually is interesting that you bring up some of the theological debates. I'm, of course, not a theologian, and this is something we were even discussing, and I wish I could actually put some of this in this film, but the nature of this documentary it's a different format, and we wouldn't be doing justice, but if you kind of even get into the history, and I'm sure Farzana would know better, the parliament session when the blasphemy laws were being amended to include the death penalty back in '86, and then again subsequent in 1990, for the Sharia Council to actually make something a law, you need an ijtima, which is a consensus amongst all the different varying schools or firqas of the Muslim faiths and their representatives that were there. So there was no ijtima. Technically, there wasn't an ijtima. There was 5 representatives, and 4 of them were, yes, go ahead. I think one of the schools of thoughts opposed it, but it was basically under duress. He basically conceded, and this law was passed. So that's something important to remember. The other thing is, there have been other schools of thought that have said that our blasphemy law in Pakistan is actually based on hadiths that are inaccurate in their interpretation and implementation, the way it's used in Pakistan, because some religious theologians argue that actually in blasphemy there is forgiveness.
Yeah.
So,
No, I think you raise a really interesting and valid point, and I think just listening to what you're saying and just your introduction to yourself is, in a way, we're the story of Pakistan. You're Amedy, I'm Sunni, you're Shia. My friend Imran's Sushi, as I like to call it, Sunni and Shia. And that is one of the beauties of Pakistan, but I think one of the sadder aspects of this entire case of blasphemy, which is the fact that you have South Asia, which has always been a very plural place, a place of multi-beliefs and traditions, languages and cultures, and imperfect in many ways, but we have these laws which are now able to really drive divisions in very dark ways. And I think this film really shows the power of these laws, and the fact that people can take these laws and this power into their own hands. We have another question from this gentleman over here.
Thank you. I was going to ask something very different, but this is a fascinating conversation, and what fascinates me is that ultimately is boiling down to identity, and so much of that came through very strong in the film as well. There was one scene that really struck me, and it was when Rizvi himself said, in a very, very disparaging way, those liberals who voted for Trump. And a Western audience naturally would laugh at that, because a lot of us would think, well, hang on, it's not liberals that are voting for Trump. We would think actually it's staunch conservatives, and a lot of the far right would be supporting this guy. I think what my question is, and perhaps from a filmmaker's perspective, is how perhaps brave might it be to explore some of the familiarities that a Western audience sees in some of this, because this feels a lot more familiar to watch than perhaps it would have done 15 or 20 years ago taking into account the effect of social media and this age of anger that we're living in. So I guess I'm just wondering where some of those dots might join, and how might you tell a perhaps more nuanced story through that as a filmmaker?
And possibly a place we may go as Western society, a la Handmaid's Tale, maybe? Sorry, go ahead, Mo.
I think the documentary medium itself is restricted in the sense that the nuance that this kind of a story or any story deserves is too vast to just encapsulate in one film. The medium doesn't. The most that I can do is actually get people interested in those stories and to actually have them actually then do their own research or look into and bring attention to a specific issue. So even with my film, yes, I recognize there's a lot of stuff that I would like to fit in that unfortunately I just can't, because there is that time limitation, and because there is also that audience limitation. I mean, I have the fight between actually telling a narrative and then also instilling it with so much context that it becomes what filmmakers call a Wikipedia cut.
There's also sorry to interrupt, Mo, there's a weird connectivity between East and West with the social media sequences and stuff, because when we were showing the film to commissioners and broadcasters, when you see all that hate going up on Facebook for Gulalai and stuff, I know it sounds odd, but people sort of go, oh yeah, that happens here. It's a really, when we talk about, all this hate and social media and how do we contain it, and how can it be contained in Pakistan? Hello.
It's not unique to Pakistan.
How can it be contained in Britain right now with the sort of, we saw it all through Brexit and all of that. But it is really strange that I was struck, making a film like this some years ago, getting a sort of sort of Pakistani audience to engage with it. When you have sequences like that, it's much easier to engage because you think, yes, that's happening here. And that's profoundly depressing. There's got to be a way of turning it around. But it's sort of, you do sit up and go, oh, gosh, aren't they modern over there? I mean, it's like, really? Is that sort of...
We are running out of time, so I'm going to take a quick question from you, and then I'm going to take a question from this side of the room. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for this. Brilliant, and I'm a big fan.
He's also my cousin.
Yeah, I have to be a big fan. But I wanted to quickly, ask this. Following your other work as well, what struck me about this, and also continuing this conversation about social media, we get videos of Rizvi being the Bond villain, as you say, but then when I saw his portrayal in this, I have to actually say that you've displayed an incredible amount of restraint with this. And I wanted to ask that question as a filmmaker, because I think the people that get these videos of Rizvi know what an incredible caricature he is. And to sort of rein yourself in, how did you decide to do that?
I think that was really important for me at the top of the film. Even Fiona and even Safi, who edited the film, was that for safety purposes, I wanted to keep it a neutral film, and I wanted to keep it such a film that he could watch it and be ultimately fine with what he said, because we didn't manipulate anything that he said. And then we could show the other side, and that's it. And then we really leave it to the audience to ultimately decide. And that's something that I definitely wanted to aspire to even with this film, because there were a lot of safety concerns to be that. And aside from that, we've seen that kind of editorial landscape where it's very easy to show a cleric with a beard frothing at the mouth and shooting the Kalashnikovs, and I think those stories did exist and have existed back in the day, since post. Since the early days of 9/11 coverage, and even predating that in Afghanistan. So I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to have that kind of caricature, because I don't think ultimately I would be then doing something unique or making something compelling that is telling a much more nuanced story. So that's what was important, to follow that editorial lens.
I think what's also important to say is Rizvi doesn't speak in English in this film, which means something is lost in translation. And one of the things that always struck me reporting on Pakistan or other parts of the country where you see these people who, through my Western gaze, some dude with a beard with a giant turban, like, why are people following him? Is the way they speak is they have this ability to communicate with their constituency, for lack of a better word, in a way that I don't think you can understand when you see a subtitle, when you sort of do not speak the language. But if you do, and you listen to what they say, even if you don't believe a word of what this person says, you understand why there is a segment of Pakistani society which would be like, fuck, this is our dude, man. Like, he gets me. And sadly, you know, not sadly, but quite frankly, you see that a lot in Pakistan. Whether it's...
And they know it.
And they know it.
They know exactly how to craft their identity and their image as sexy.
And we've seen this time and again, whether it was him or Gadri or even Imran Khan, for lack of a better word. Imran Khan is a great orator. You know, he's now the prime minister of the country. This was a man who was a party of one for years. He is now the prime minister of the country. Sure, he brought, you know, the Cricket World Cup to Pakistan. Sure, he was this playboy. Sure, he was married to Jemima Khan. But what he was able to do over those years was become this master communicator. If you look at the images of Imran Khan at his jalsas, at his rallies, I have never seen so many human beings standing in one place for one human being. And that is the power that we see in South Asia. This is not a Pakistani thing. This is a South Asian thing, possibly even beyond
Well,
that.
you're much younger than me. You're much younger than me, but that's what happened
With
those of us
with
growing up
Zulfikar
today,
Ali
with
Bhutto,
Zulfikar
right.
Ali Bhutto.
Yeah.
But can I just make
Sure.
one small point? I mean, I think ultimately, yes, I mean, it is manipulation, it is being able to communicate with your constituency, etc. But just sitting over there and watching this film brought home to me, you know, the extent to which ultimately the whole issue of blasphemy is tied to questions of Muslimness.
Sure.
In and against a context where there is so much uncertainty about what Pakistan stands for, which Islam it stands for, where definitions of the Muslim are still being contested.
And which
And this
remains
is-
an open question in 2020.
Absolutely, and I think that, you know, in a sense, that's what makes the reform of the blasphemy laws so very
vital.
difficult.
We have one last question. You guys can fight over who.
That's where the Quran is. Isn't the Quran the definition of who?
Or would you like
No.
Isn't the Holy Quran the definition?
I just want to say, the thing is that how different is it from, I know that you're saying it's about blasphemy, and in Pakistan's case, it is blasphemy that's the issue. But look at Britain, Brexit, Nigel Farage is no different to this guy.
Populist.
Look at
Sure.
it's populism
Trump.
across the world, and everybody seems to be seeking for that. And ultimately,
Guys,
it's
it's our
about
vote share as well.
ultimately it's about the working classes of the world who've had enough of these corrupt elitist politicians.
Right.
who are not serving.
But if
It's
you're
all about
working,
poverty.
but if you're working in the context of a state that historically makes extravagant claims to be acting in the name of Islam and furthering a divine purpose, and I'm talking about a state and its political leaders who make these things, then we're talking about something.
Exactly the same arguments. What I'm trying to say is that this is not just a Pakistan issue of blasphemy.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that it's not like, okay.
But it's not mere populism either.
It's happening in India. The Hindu nationalism is all about taking that position to garner votes and, you know, so it's
Listen,
happening
guys.
across the world. I'm sorry.
This is an amazing conversation. Let's take it down to the bar. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank all of you. First of all, I want to thank Mo Naqvi for an amazing film, Fiona Sturton, and of course, Dr. Farzana Sheikh, and to all of you for coming here on a Wednesday night. We really appreciate it. We're all going downstairs. I hope you all can come and we can carry on with this conversation. Thank you again.
Great film.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sure.